Welcome to True Crime Cases today. We are unveiling a shocking story of jealousy and violence. Stephen, Aria, Amelia, and Baker. Brandon were the picture of success, an affluent family living in the lap of luxury admired by all who knew them. But on the morning of January 1st, their sprawling mansion stood eerily silent. The life they once knew now nothing more than a haunting memory. The family had been brutally betrayed, their death orchestrated by those they trusted most. As the investigation unraveled, it became clear someone close to them had carefully crafted their demise, and the truth would shock a community that believed they knew them all too well. The Brandon family was the embodiment of success and happiness, living in an exquisite mansion perched atop the serene Willow Crest Hills. Stephen Brandon, the head of the family, had built his fortune from the ground up. A savvy entrepreneur, he was respected in the business community for his keen eye and ability to turn risks into opportunities. His wife, Aria, was equally admired for her artistic talents. Her landscape paintings captured the essence of nature so vividly that they often fetched thousands of dollars at galleries. Together, they seemed to have it all: wealth, love, and two bright children who were their pride and joy. Amelia, the eldest child, was a 19-year-old aspiring musician. She had a natural gift for the piano and was well on her way to securing scholarship at a prestigious music academy. Baker, her 21-year-old brother, was the family sports enthusiast. His passion for football had already earned him a place on the school team, and many believed he had a promising future in athletics. The family shared a close bond, often hosting elaborate dinners and gatherings to celebrate milestones and strengthen their tie to friends and neighbors. On the last day of the year, the Brandon decided to throw a grand New Year's Eve party. It was an annual tradition, but this year's event was particularly special. Stephen had recently closed a multi-million-dollar deal, and the celebration was as much about that as it was about welcoming. New Year invitations were sent out to an exclusive guest list that included business associates, close friends, and prominent figures in the community. The Brandon mansion came alive with glittering decorations, golden string lights, and tables adorned with lavish spreads of food and drink. As the guests arrived, they were greeted warmly by Stephen and Aria, who looked every bit the gracious hosts. Amelia's piano music filled the air, adding a touch of sophistication to the festive atmosphere. Baker, ever the charmer, mingled with guests, sharing stories about his latest football. Stephanie's laughter and conversation flowed freely, the house buzzing with energy and joy. As the evening progressed, the Brandon led their guests onto the spacious terrace to watch the fireworks display. With champagne flutes in hand, they counted down the final seconds of the year. At the stroke of midnight, the sky erupted in vibrant colors, illuminating the faces of the cheering crowd. Stephen gave heartfelt toast, expressing gratitude for the year's blessings and his hopes for an even brighter future. His words resonated with everyone, drawing applause and cheers as the night wound down. The guests bid their farewells, exchanging hugs and good wishes for the year ahead. Stephen and Aria lingered in the foyer, thanking each person for coming, their smiles as radiant as ever. Amelia and Baker retired to their rooms, tired but happy. The house, once filled with laughter and music, gradually fell silent as the Brandon family went to bed, unaware that this would be their final night together. The morning after the lavish celebration was a cold and unsettling silence. The first sign of something being wrong came when the housekeeper Mrs. Ellis arrived at the mansion just before sunrise. She had worked for the Brandon family for years and was accustomed to the routines of the household. She had arrived early to begin cleaning up after the festivities, knowing that the family would sleep in after the late night. As she entered the foyer, she noticed something strange. There were no footsteps or sounds from the family's rooms, which was unusual. Given how early it was, Mrs. Ellis paused for a moment, thinking that perhaps family had all taken the opportunity to sleep in late after a long night of celebrating. As she continued through the house, however, her unease began to grow. The normally vibrant mansion felt unnervingly still, almost as if something was off kilter. She proceeded cautiously, checking each room as she made her way toward the dining area. When she reached the grand dining room, her breath caught in her throat. There, sprawled across the table, lay the bodies of Stephen, Arya, Casson, and Raw and Baker Brandon. The sight was so horrific that Mrs. Ellis stumbled back in shock, almost tripping over a chair. The air felt thick, as if time had frozen in that very moment. At first, she thought she might be imagining things, but the sight before her was undeniable. Each member of the family was lifeless, their faces pale and unmoving, as though they had fallen asleep in an instant. But there was no mistaking tragedy unfolding before her. Panicked, she rushed to call the authorities. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, trying to explain through her sobs what she had found. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the quiet morning air as law enforcement arrived at the scene. Detective Oliver Stone, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for his sharp instincts, was called to lead the case. He stood at the threshold of the Brandon mansion, taking in the scene. With quiet resolve inside, the authorities began their investigation. The bodies were carefully examined, and the scene was combed for any clues. At first glance, everything seemed normal. No signs of forced entry, no apparent struggle, and nothing seemed out of place. The furniture was undisturbed, and the decorations from the party still hung in the windows, a reminder of the festive evening before. It was as though the family had simply fallen into an eternal sleep. The cause of death wasn't immediately clear. Detective Stone observed the bodies closely, noting how they were positioned at the table as if they had been gathered for a meal. There was no visible trauma, no bleeding, nothing that would suggest a violent end. The only anomaly was a faint, strange smell in the air, something almost metallic, but too faint to place at first. Carbon monoxide poisoning seemed the most likely explanation. The mansion, though modern, had a large fireplace in an aging heating system that could have malfunctioned during the night. Yet, when the house was tested for carbon monoxide, the levels were found to be normal. The detective's mind raced with possibilities, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something more sinister was at play. It was as if the family had been deliberately and quietly taken from this world. As the investigation continued, the authorities began to look at the family's recent activities: Stephen's business dealings, Ria's gallery exhibitions, and the children's social lives, but nothing stood out as a clear motive. The Brandon had no known enemies, no public disputes. Still, Detective Stone felt the weight of an unnerving suspicion deep in his gut. This wasn't just an ordinary tragedy. Something more was hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. As the investigation into the deaths of the Brandon family deepened, Detective Oliver Stone began to suspect that the initial theory of carbon monoxide poisoning was far too simple, with the toxicology reports showing no traces of carbon monoxide in their bloodstreams. The investigation took a darker turn. The cause of death was still unknown, but the detective's instincts told him that Someone had carefully orchestrated the deaths. This was no accident. A breakthrough came when the coroner revealed that the Brandon had all died from the effects of a rare toxin found only in certain plants from South America. The poison was almost undetectable without specialized testing, which meant that the killer had to be someone with a deep knowledge of toxicology. Detective Stone's mind raced as he considered the implications of this new discovery. Whoever had done this was methyl calculating and had planned the murders with chilling precision. The detective began by looking into the family's relationships and connections to see if anyone might have had a motive. One of the first names that came to mind was Elias Renshaw, a business rival of Stephen Brandon. The two men had been fierce competitors in the real estate market, and recently their professional rivalry had taken a bitter turn. Stephen's recent success had left Elias reeling as he had lost a major deal that he had been depending on. It was clear that Elias resented Stephen's success, and that resentment could have easily turned into something far darker. However, Elias had an airtight alibi for the night of the murders. He had been at a party in a nearby city surrounded by dozens of witnesses. So what would this lead? Exhausted, Detective Stone shifted his focus to the family's social circle. He began to examine their friends, acquaintances, and anyone who had recently been in their lives. One name kept coming up: Miriam, Kate, an artist who had once been close to Eleanor Brandon. Miriam had been furious when she accused Arya of plagiarizing her work, a claim that had caused a rift between them. Miriam had been vocal about her anger toward Arya in the months leading up to the party, and although she had no direct evidence to support her accusations, her bitterness was palpable. However, despite Miriam's hostile behavior, there was no indication that she had the means or motive to carry out such a calculated and lethal act. Still, Detective Stone couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. As he dug deeper, he discovered that Miriam had attended the New Year's Eve party. The detectives combed through the guest list, hoping to find any connections that might lead to a breakthrough. Among the names was someone who had not been on the detectives' radar before: Damon Clive, a man who had once been very close to Stephen Brandon. Damon had disappeared from the scene years ago, and the family had spoken little about him. The name was vaguely familiar, but Stone couldn't place why. As Stone's team began investigating Damien, they uncovered a troubling piece of history. Damon was in fact Stephen's estranged half-brother. The two had shared the same father, but their relationship had been strained for years. Damien had been bitter and angry ever since he had been excluded from his father's wealth and inheritance, decision that had only intensified his resentment towards Stephen over the years. Damon had attempted to reconcile with his half-brother, but Stephen had been wary of him. Knowing the extent of Damien's bitterness, the detective suspicion grew stronger. Damon had been a regular guest at the Brandon household before his falling out with Stephen, and it reappeared only recently. It was clear that Damon had a motive: envy and a thirst for revenge. But could he have gone so far as to murder the entire family? Detective Stone knew that this was the lead that could break the case wide open. He just had to find evidence to prove it. Stone's team began to dig deeper into Damien's life. They discovered that he had recently been in contact with a former business associate, someone who had connections to illegal markets where rare poisons were sold. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. The detective had a feeling that they were on the cusp of uncovering the truth behind the Brandon family's tragic deaths. But with each new revelation, the question remained: who else was involved? in this twisted plot? And would they be able to stop the killer before another tragedy struck Detective Stone's investigation took a startling turn when he discovered that Dan and Clive was not working alone. Through a series of phone records and financial transactions, Detective uncovered a surprising link between Damien and a woman named La Hart, an assistant at one of Eleanor Brandon's art galleries. La had always been seen as a quiet, unassuming figure in the art world. There was more to her story than anyone had realized. Further digging revealed that La had been in contact with Dan for months before the New Year's Eve party. The two had been working together to orchestrate the deaths of the Brandon family, carefully planning every detail of their scheme. Leia's role had been crucial. She had access to the Brandon mansion at all hours. Given her position with Eleanor, she had become a trusted figure in the household, even accompanying Eleanor to several of her exhibitions and dinners. No one had suspected that she was harboring such a dark agenda. It was quickly becoming clear that Leela had been manipulated by Damien, who had preyed on her vulnerability. She had been drawn into his web of lies and deceit. Initially seeing him as a person offering her a chance to prove herself, Damien had convinced her that their plan would secure a future for both of them, one without the shadow of the Brandon family and their wealth. What started as a small desire for recognition had turned into something much more sinister. Leela had fallen under Damien's spell, believing that together they could seize control of the life she had always wanted, one free from Maria's influence. As Detective Stone pieced together their twisted relationship, the true nature of the conspiracy began to emerge. Damon and Leila had not only plotted the deaths of Stephen L., Eleanor, Amelia, and Baker, but they had also worked tirelessly to frame Ella's Renshaw for the crime. They knew that the business rivalry between Elias and Stephen was well known, and they counted on it to steer suspicion away from themselves. If Elias could be implicated, the investigation would stall, giving them the freedom to continue with their plan. Leela's role in the plot was especially shocking. While Damien had been the mastermind, it was Leela who had made sure the deaths went off without a hitch. She had been the one to poison the wine at the New Year's Eve dinner. Subtle but deadly act that ensured the Brandon family would die within hours of consuming it. It had been a brilliant and methodical move designed to appear like a natural, untraceable event. By the time the authorities arrived the following morning, there would be no obvious signs of foul play, leaving the detective struggling to find any leads. But as Detective Stone reviewed the evidence, he began to realize just how carefully Damien and Leela had covered their tracks. They had thought of everything: the perfect alias, the manipulated evidence, and the poison that would leave no trace unless searched for. Specifically, the plan had been executed flawlessly. Almost there was one thing they hadn't anticipated: Detective Stone's relentless pursuit of the truth. As the investigation progressed, Stone's team discovered that both Damon and Leela had been in possession of the rare toxin used to kill the Brandon. The toxin was not easy to come by, and it required a certain level of expertise to handle it. The same chemical had been found in Damien's storage unit, further solidifying his involvement in the crime. Law, too, had been found with traces of the poison on her clothing, a damning piece of evidence that tied her directly to the murders. At last, Detective Stone suspicions had been confirmed. Damien and Law had worked together to kill the Brandon family, driven by a combination of greed, resentment, and manipulation. The detective couldn't help but feel a sense of horror at the level of planning that had gone into the killings. It was no longer just a case of a family tragedy. It was a calculated act of vengeance executed with chilling precision. The question now was how long it would take to bring the perpetrators to justice and whether they would face the full consequences of their actions. The case was far from over, but Stone was closer than ever to solving the mystery behind the deaths of the Brandon family. The final piece of the puzzle was within his reach, and he knew that it was only a matter of time before Damon and Leela would be held accountable for the lives they had taken. As Detective Stone pieced together the full extent of Damon, Clive, and Leela Hart's involvement in the tragic deaths of the Brandon family, he discovered a shocking layer to their plan. Both had been careful not to leave behind obvious evidence, but Stone's relentless investigation was unraveling their meticulously crafted alias. The poison that killed Brandon, the rare South American toxin, had been traced back to an illegal supplier with whom Damien had recently made contact. It was clear now that their plot had been years in the making. Damien's envy and resentment toward his half-brother Stephen had festered into a deep obsession, and Leela had become the unwitting accomplice in his twisted scheme. The final breakthrough came when Detective Stone discovered that Damien had planted false evidence to mislead investigation. He had forged emails, phone records, and financial documents to make it appear as though Elias Renshaw, Stephen's business rival, had a motive for the murders. Damon had known that Elias was already under suspicion due to his bitter rivalry with Stephen, and he had skillfully manipulated the investigation by framing him as the killer. Renshaw had been left in the dark, his reputation tarnished by the circumstantial evidence planted by Damon and Leela. The detectives now had enough to make an arrest. Damon Clive was brought in for questioning, and after hours of intense interrogation, he finally cracked. He admitted to orchestrating